In the autumn of 1919, the high plains of Carbon County, Wyoming, had a way of making a man feel observed. Not by other men, though there were plenty of those riding the county road with their collars up and their opinions already formed. The plains themselves watched you. The sky pressed down flat and enormous, and the wind that came out of the north arrived without preamble, without warning, as though it had been building speed across 1,000 miles of nothing and had finally found something worth hitting. A man building something strange in that kind of country drew attention the way a fire draws moths. And in the autumn of 1919, Eli Harmon was building something very strange indeed. He was digging a trench. Not for irrigation, not for a foundation in any conventional sense. It was a long, deliberate channel running from the north wall of his small log cabin southward to the south wall of his barn, a distance of exactly 40 feet, measured twice with a carpenter's string he'd stretched taut between two iron stakes. He dug in the mornings when the light was low and golden and the frost still clung to the dead grass, and he dug in the afternoons until the shadows went long and the cold came back down like a lid settling over a pot. He moved earth with a steady, almost mechanical rhythm, the kind of rhythm a man develops when he has learned to work without thinking about working, when the body takes over and the mind goes somewhere else entirely. Neighbors riding past on the county road would slow their horses. They would watch him from a distance, this lean, quiet man not yet 30, and they would try to make sense of what they were seeing. Some would stop their horses entirely and stand in the stirrups to get a better look. Then they would ride on and say nothing until they reached the trading post or the feed store or the church social, and then they would say quite a lot. He was building a tunnel, people decided, a tunnel connecting his house to his barn, and the conclusion the valley reached with the efficient certainty that small communities applied to the behavior of outsiders was that the new man, the veteran, was afraid of the snow. They were not entirely wrong about what he was building. They were almost completely wrong about why. Eli Harmon had come to Carbon County in the spring of 1918 with his wife Clara and their two daughters Ada and Meg, who were 7 and 5 years old respectively, and who had strong opinions about everything from breakfast porridge to the correct way to name a horse. He had purchased 160 acres of high plains grassland at a price that reflected the land's honesty about its own limitations. The cabin that came with the property had been abandoned by its previous owner 2 winters prior, and the reasons for that abandonment were visible in the cracked chinking between the logs, the warped door frames, the fireplace that drew poorly in a north wind. Eli had spent his first summer repairing what could be repaired and accepting what could not. He rechinked the logs with a mixture of clay and cattle hair. He rebuilt the fireplace throat from salvaged brick. He cut and stacked 5 cords of firewood from the cottonwood and pine on the property's eastern edge, and he looked at that stack in September and thought it was probably enough. He had learned a great deal about being wrong since leaving Wyoming behind as a young man. His previous years had not been spent in carpentry or ranching or any of the quiet occupations that the high plains rewarded. He had been a combat engineer with the 1st Division sent overseas in 1917, and the work of a combat engineer in a war was not romantic work. It was intimate, exhausting, and perpetually unglamorous. He had built fortifications in mud that wanted to swallow everything. He had constructed covered positions in freezing conditions where the cold was not simply a discomfort, but an adversary with its own intentions, and where a structure that failed to account for the physics of that cold would get men killed just as surely as any enemy action. He had learned to think about wind and heat and moisture the way a physician thinks about the body as systems in constant negotiation with specific failure points and specific remedies. He had also learned that the men with the loudest certainty about how things should be built were rarely the men who had watched their buildings fail. Clara Harmon had not come to Wyoming out of ignorance or blind faith in her husband's judgment. She was the daughter of a Nebraska grain farmer who had taught her to read a barometer before she could multiply fractions, and she had kept the household accounts since she was 14 years old, with a precision that her father, a man not given to complimenting women on their intellect, had described as unnatural. She read, not the novels that circulated at the church social, though she read those too. She read seed catalogs and soil surveys and the agricultural bulletins that came from the state extension office, and she had read in the winter of 1917, while Eli was overseas, a pamphlet on the thermal properties of building materials that she had found in a box of her father's papers. She had not understood all of it. She had understood enough. When Eli came home in the late autumn of 1918, thinner and quieter, and carrying something behind his eyes that he did not discuss, Clara had made a practical assessment and said Wyoming. He had agreed. They had sold what there was to sell, packed what there was to pack, and pointed themselves west. Ada had cried when they left Nebraska. Meg had asked if Wyoming had dogs. Clara had told her that Wyoming almost certainly had dogs. This had satisfied Meg completely. The cabin was a solid structure by the standards of what it was. Chinked logs, a stone fireplace, a sleeping loft accessible by a ladder that Ada had already determined she could climb faster than anyone. By the standards of a frontier homestead, it was more than adequate. It was tight and dry, and it sat on a slight rise that gave them a clear view of the county road in both directions. Eli had looked at it the first morning and told Clara that it was a good house. The first winter told them what a good house was worth against a Wyoming winter. The cold arrived in November 1918 without ceremony, a hard freeze that locked the mud overnight and did not release it. By December, the temperature was regularly dropping below zero, and the wind out of the north was not the variable gusting wind of Nebraska that came and went and gave you time to recover between assaults. This wind was persistent. It was geological in its patience. It hit the north wall of the cabin, and it stayed there pressing against the logs with a constancy that was almost personal, as though the wind had chosen this particular house and intended to have it. Eli burned through his 5 cords of firewood by mid-January and spent 2 grim days in brutal cold cutting and hauling more. By the time the first winter ended, he had burned 7 cords total to heat a structure that measured less than 600 square feet inside, and the temperature inside that structure had rarely climbed above 50 degrees. He had been up every 3 hours through the worst nights, feeding the firebox, watching the flames calculating. Ada and Meg slept in their coats and hats beneath a mountain of quilts that Clara had been quietly adding to since October. Clara stuffed rags along the baseboards each evening and found them frozen rigid by morning. A thick layer of frost grew on the interior walls, and the water bucket in the corner would sometimes be a solid block of ice before dawn. They survived. Survival was what they had, and Eli understood perfectly well that survival and living were not the same thing. Through that long winter, he did something that most men in his position would not have thought to do. He observed, not with despair, not with the helpless frustration that the cold seemed designed to produce, but with the methodical attention he had trained himself to apply to problems that wanted to kill him. He watched the snow as it accumulated, noting how the drifts built up high and tight against the east and west walls, while the north side of the cabin was scoured almost bare by the wind. He watched the frost patterns on the interior walls and noted that they were heaviest on the north wall and thinned as they moved toward the south. He pressed his palm flat against the log walls at different hours of the day and different temperatures, feeling for the subtle difference between a wall losing heat to still cold air and a wall losing heat to moving cold air. The difference was not subtle at all. It was enormous. He lay awake one night in late January when the wind was at its worst, and he thought about something he had read in a technical manual during his service, a document about the thermal insulation properties of earthwork fortifications. The document had been dry and dense, and he had read it not out of interest but out of professional obligation. One figure had stayed with him without his realizing it, the way certain numbers attach themselves to memory and weight. A wall exposed to still air at 0 degrees Fahrenheit loses heat at a measurable rate. The same wall at the same temperature exposed to a wind of 30 miles per hour loses heat at a rate 20 times faster. 20 times. He got up and stood at the window and watched the snow moving across the yard in solid horizontal sheets. The barn stood 40 feet to the north, a dark rectangular mass in the blowing white, and in the pale light it looked less like a building than like a wall. A massive accidental wall standing directly between the cabin and the direction the wind came from. His barn was already blocking some fraction of the wind that would otherwise hit the cabin directly. He had simply never thought about what that meant or what it could mean if the blocking were made complete and deliberate. He went back to bed and lay still for a long time. Clara, who was not asleep, said nothing. She had learned to recognize the particular quality of his silence when something was forming in it. In the morning, he sat at the kitchen table with a piece of scrap wood and a nail using the nail as a stylus to scratch lines into the soft pine. Clara stood at the stove and watched him over her shoulder. The two shapes he drew were a rectangle for the cabin and a larger rectangle for the barn, with a long, narrow rectangle connecting their facing walls. He told her, "We're not fighting the cold, we're fighting the wind. The house is like a man standing in a gale without a coat. Doesn't matter how warm he is inside, the wind just pulls the heat right out of him." Clara turned fully away from the stove. "So you give the house a coat?" "I close the gap between the cabin and the barn, build a corridor, enclose it, bury the walls in the excavated earth. The wind never touches the cabin's north wall again. The air inside the corridor stays still. Still air is insulation. It's the same principle as a double-pane window. The dead air space between the two panes is what actually holds the heat, not the glass itself. We'd just be doing it on a scale the whole house can use." Clara looked at the drawing for a long time. Then she went to the shelf above the dry goods and took down a small ledger, the one she used for household accounts, and she opened it to a clean page. She wrote the date at the top in her careful compressed handwriting. Below it, she wrote the outside temperature, which she had checked that morning on the porch thermometer. Below that, she wrote the inside temperature, taken from the thermometer that hung next to the kitchen window. Below that, she wrote the number of split logs they had used since yesterday. Eli watched her do this. "What are you doing?" Clara did not look up. "If we're going to prove this works, we're going to need to know what it looked like before." She kept that ledger every morning from that day forward. Through the rest of the first winter, through the spring thaw and the summer and the dry, hot autumn of 1919. Every morning before the girls came down from the loft, before the coffee was properly boiled, Clara Harmon stood at the window with her ledger and her pencil and wrote down what the thermometer said and how much wood they had burned the day before. She did not tell anyone she was doing this. It did not occur to her that she needed to. The opportunity to build came in late August of 1919, when word reached Carbon County that the old Army Supply Depot 30 miles south was being cleared out and its surplus materials offered at auction. Eli drove the wagon down on a Tuesday morning and came back in the afternoon with the wagon bed loaded high rough-cut lumber in various dimensions, several dozen sheets of corrugated tin roofing, a coil of heavy wire, and a quantity of tar paper that had been stored dry and was still serviceable. He had spent $75, which was more than he had intended and less than he had feared. He bought $35 worth of additional dimensional lumber from Briggs's mill on the western edge of town, and $12 worth of hardware and fasteners from the general store. He recorded each expenditure in the household ledger under a separate column Clara had labeled simply corridor. The total came to $122, a number Eli could account for to the penny. The digging began the next morning. He started at the north wall of the cabin, marking out the trench with stakes and string 40 feet long, 10 feet wide, running due north to the south wall of the barn. He dug to 4 feet below the frost line, which in Carbon County meant 4 feet of serious work. The soil came up in heavy rocky chunks that he piled systematically to either side of the trench. This was not waste material. This was insulation waiting to be installed. He laid a 6-inch bed of coarse gravel along the trench floor for drainage. He had learned in his service overseas in conditions he did not describe to Clara in detail, and she did not press him to describe, that water was the enemy of any below-grade construction, and that drainage properly designed at the beginning was 1,000 times easier than water damage remediated after the fact. On the gravel, he built low stone walls 2 feet high from fieldstone he had been clearing from the north pasture since spring mortared, with a mixture of clay and sand. On these stone footings, he raised the lumber, framing vertical studs, horizontal plates, a low-pitched roof that shed water rather than collecting it. The structure was functional in its aesthetics and intended to be nothing more. From the outside, what emerged over 2 weeks of steady work looked like a crude lean-to, low and dark, running between the two buildings like a scar healing over. But the visible part was not the point. The point was what he did with the earth. Every shovelful he had excavated from the trench went back against the exterior walls of the new corridor, packed and tamped in layers until the earthen mound reached the eaves on both the east and west sides. The effect was of a long green hill rising between the cabin and the barn, burying the structure's walls completely. The only visible parts were the low dark openings at either end and the dull gleam of the tin roof running along the ridge. The corrugated tin went down over tar paper, with each seam overlapping generously in the direction of water flow. Where the new roof met the existing log walls of cabin and barn, he worked carefully with tin he had cut and hammered into flashing, sealing each junction against the moisture intrusion that Owen Briggs would later identify as his primary concern. He cut two small, shuttered vents high on the east and west walls of the corridor position to allow summer ventilation and prevent the condensation buildup that could, in the mild months, work against the very thermal properties the structure was designed to create. The vents had wooden shutters that could be closed tight in winter. He built them himself from scrap lumber and fitted them with the simple latch hardware he had purchased at the general store. When it was finished, he stood at the county road and looked at what he had made. The cabin had a coat. Clara came out and stood beside him in the mild September afternoon, a shawl pulled around her shoulders more out of habit than necessity. She looked at the long, grass-covered mound connecting their two buildings for a long time without speaking. Then Eli, "People are going to think we've lost our minds." He did not look at her. He was looking at the northern horizon where the sky was already hardening to a pale metallic blue that meant the season was turning. Let them. The first man to say so officially was Owen Briggs. Briggs ran the sawmill that had supplied the lumber for half the cabins in the valley, including the original shell of the Harmon cabin, before Eli and Clara had arrived to take it over. He was a large, deliberate man in his late 50s, with hands like roofing mallets and the precise professional vocabulary of someone who had spent 40 years building things and thinking about how they might fail. He was not a cruel man. He was, in his own estimation, a realistic one. He came by on a Thursday morning when Eli was finishing the last of the earthwork on the corridor's east side, tamping down the soil with the back of a spade. Briggs rode his horse to the fence line and sat there watching for a few minutes before he swung down and walked over with his hands in his coat pockets. He circled the finished structure, slowly kicking at the base of the earthen berm with his boot heel, squinting at the roof line, crouching to look at the junction where the new flashing met the cabin's north wall logs. When he straightened up, his expression was the expression of a doctor delivering news he had delivered too many times before. "Harmon, I don't know what they taught you in the service, but this won't hold." Eli stopped tamping. He listened. Briggs pointed at the wall junction with one thick finger. "You've built a moisture trap right there. Come January, snow is going to pile up in that corner something fierce. It melts, it seeps into those logs, and in 2 winters, that whole north wall is soft as bread. You'll be pulling mushrooms out of your bedroom wall." He kicked the earth berm again, a gesture of professional finality. "And all this dirt against the wood siding, that's inviting rot and insects both. Earth needs to breathe, wood needs to breathe. You've buried the thing alive." Eli set down the spade and looked at Briggs for a moment. "The flashing runs 12 inches up the wall behind a tar paper layer. The earth stops 6 inches below the sill plate on the framing. There's a gravel drainage bed at 4 feet down." He spoke without heat, the way a man recites specifications rather than argues a position. "The moisture question I took seriously. The answer is drainage and separation, not air gap." Briggs absorbed this. He was not a man who changed his mind quickly, but he was a man who listened to specifics when they were offered. He looked at the wall junction again. He could not see the flashing from where he stood, but the explanation was coherent. Still, his overall assessment did not shift. "It's not just the moisture, the principle of it." He gestured at the structure as a whole, the buried walls, the low dark openings. "A house needs to face the weather, not hide from it. You're teaching it to be afraid." Eli picked up the spade. "We'll know in February." Briggs left. The story traveled the county road in both directions before nightfall, acquiring detail and certainty as it went. Owen Briggs himself said Harmon's construction was a disaster in the making, specific failure in 2 winters, possibly 1. The professional verdict carried the weight of 40 years of sawdust and finished structures. By the following Sunday, the new shape of the Harmon homestead, that low grass-covered mound between cabin and barn, had acquired a name. People were calling it the Coward's Corridor. The public christening happened on a Wednesday at the general store, and Clara was present for it. She had gone in for salt and coffee and found the usual gathering of midweek men who had errands in town or had manufactured the appearance of errands because the company was better than the alternative. Dale Sutton was there, loud and wide-shouldered, a rancher who had been in Carbon County since before the county had its proper name and who wore his tenure in the valley like a medal he expected others to acknowledge. He saw Clara come through the door, and something shifted in his posture, the casual expansion of a man preparing to perform for an audience he already has. "Well," Sutton's voice filled the store with room to spare. "How's the gopher hole coming along?" Mrs. Harmon Eli finished digging in for the season. The men near the counter offered the cautious, complicit laughter of people who are not sure something is funny, but are sure they want to be on the right side of it. Clara set her list on the counter and did not look at Sutton for a moment. When she did look at him, her expression was the expression of a woman doing arithmetic. "Dale." Her voice was measured and entirely without apology. "How many cords did you burn last winter?" Sutton blinked. The question was not the response he had prepared for. "To keep your main house above, what was it, 45 degrees, how many cords?" The laughter in the room died quietly. Sutton's jaw moved briefly without producing words. Clara had already turned back to the counter and her list. She bought her salt and coffee. She walked out of the store, and the door closed behind her without drama. And the men inside stood in the specific silence of people who have just watched something they will need time to interpret. The name stuck. To much of the valley, Eli Harmon became the gopher, and the structure connecting his buildings became the coward's corridor. And this was the social reality that Clara returned to every time she went into town through the remaining weeks of autumn. At the quilting circle, conversations adjusted themselves when she entered. At the church social, women asked her with the soft, weaponized sympathy of genuine concern whether she was finding things difficult, whether the girls were settled, whether Eli was, and here a careful pause, all right after everything. The question of whether Eli was all right after everything was a question about the war, about what the war had done to his judgment, about whether a man who had seen what he had seen could still be trusted to make reasonable decisions about practical matters like heating a house. Clara answered every question with courtesy and gave nothing away. The pressure that cut deepest did not come from Dale Sutton or from the quilting circle. It came on a Sunday afternoon in October when Clara's brother Frank Aldridge rode out from his own spread 8 miles east for what was ostensibly a family visit and was actually something else. Frank was 41 years old and had lived in Carbon County his entire life. He had ranched the same ground his father had ranched, and he had built his reputation in the valley not on innovation or cleverness, but on the bedrock virtues of consistency and prudence, doing what had been done before, because what had been done before had been proven to work. He was not a narrow man. He loved Clara with a practical, unsentimental devotion, and he thought well of Eli in most respects. What he could not accommodate was the spectacle of a man he had vouched for, however indirectly, by the act of having him marry into the family, making himself a public joke. He stood with Eli at the fence line looking at the corridor, and he struggled visibly with the framing. Finally, he settled on the one that seemed most honest. "Eli, I'm worried about your reputation, and Clara's. People are talking, and not the way people talk when they think someone's done something clever." Eli was quiet. "Out here, a man's reputation is everything he has. You've built something that looks like you're scared of the snow. And I'm not the first person to say it to your face. I'm just the first one who's saying it because I give a damn what happens to you." Frank's voice was not unkind. It was the voice of a man who believed he was saying a necessary thing. "Maybe think about taking it down before the first snow comes. Cut your losses. People forget fast if you give them something else to look at." Clara had come out of the cabin with a coffee pot and 2 cups while Frank was speaking. She stood in the doorway and heard the last of it. She poured the coffee into both cups and brought them out and set one on the fence post near Frank's hand. She did not sit down. Frank looked at her. He recognized from a lifetime of being her brother the particular quality of her stillness. "Frank." Her voice was quiet enough that he had to lean slightly toward it. "If Eli is wrong, we'll know in February, and we'll fix it in the spring. If he's right, our girls will sleep warm this winter, while people with better reputations freeze." She picked up her own cup. "I know which of those things I'm willing to risk." Frank drank his coffee. He looked at the corridor. He looked at the sky, which was doing its October thing of threatening everything. He looked at his sister, who had not moved from her position of perfect, immovable calm. He did not change his position. A man like Frank Aldridge did not change a position in a single afternoon. But he finished his coffee, and he rode home, and he did not say anything more about taking it down. October deepened. The first hard frost came and the grass on the earthen berm went brown and stiff. Eli made his final inspections of the structure, checking the roof junctions, checking the drainage, checking the vents and their shutters. He found one place on the east side where the earthwork had settled and pulled slightly away from the framing, and he packed it back tight with clay and tamped it down. He walked the interior of the corridor twice in the cold, still air inside, running his hand along the lumber framing, feeling for flex or weakness. There was none. From the county road, the finished homestead looked altered in a way that was difficult to articulate. The cabin had not changed. The barnsey had not changed, but between them, where there had been 40 feet of open Wyoming space through which the north wind moved without impediment, there was now a long, low shape that seemed to grow from the earth rather than sit on top of it, grass-covered and settled as though it had been there long enough to earn its place. The two dark openings at either end, one in the cabin's north wall and one in the barn's south wall, were the only evidence that the mound was hollow, that there was a space inside it, a corridor of still and protected air, running like a spine between the two buildings. Clara stood beside Eli in the last mild afternoon of the season, the kind of October afternoon that Wyoming offers as an apology for what it is about to do. Ada and Meg were somewhere near the barn. The sound of Meg asking Ada something complicated about horses came across the yard in the thin autumn air. Clara held her ledger against her chest with both hands. She had not shown it to Eli recently. He had not asked to see it. It was understood between them that the ledger existed and that it was hers to keep and that its purpose would become clear at a time of her choosing. "I've been adding a column," Clara said. "Wind direction. I've been noting it each morning since March." Eli looked at her. "Every morning we had significant cold last winter. The wind was out of the north. Every single morning." She shifted the ledger. "I'm going to keep noting it this winter. And I'm going to keep noting the inside temperature and the wood consumption." A pause and then something in her voice that was not quite a challenge and not quite a promise, but carried the weight of both. "If this works the way you think it works, I want to know exactly how well it works, not approximately. Exactly." The sky to the north had gone the color of old pewter. The wind was coming as it always came from that direction. From the north across the bare open miles of nothing building and building until it found the homestead and had at it. Eli looked at the corridor. He looked at the pewter sky. He looked at his wife, who was already writing something in her ledger with a pencil she had produced from her coat pocket, her handwriting small and exact in the failing afternoon light. There was nothing to say that the structure did not already say. He had built it. It would hold or it would not. The winter would come as Wyoming winters came, without asking for anyone's permission, and it would render its verdict on the question with the complete indifference of a force that has no opinion about the people it tests. All the social architecture of the valley, the names and the pity and the professional certainty of Owen Briggs, would mean precisely nothing against that verdict. Eli called across the yard for the girls to come in. Ada's voice came back insisting she needed one more minute. Meg's voice came back asking if the one more minute could be 2 minutes. Clara was already walking toward the cabin door, her ledger under her arm, the pencil still in her hand. The northern sky pressed down hard and cold and said nothing at all about what it was preparing to do. November arrived in Carbon County, not as a season, but as a verdict. There was no gradual cooling, no polite withdrawal of warmth that gave a man time to adjust his thinking and his woodpile in equal measure. The temperature dropped 40 degrees in 18 hours on the third day of the month, and the wind that had been merely persistent became something structural, a permanent feature of the landscape, as reliable as the ridgeline to the west. By the second week, the thermometer on the trading post porch had become the most consulted document in the valley. Men stopped to read it on their way in and on their way out, and sometimes in between, not because the number changed their plans, but because knowing the number precisely gave them a small, temporary sense of authority over something that was otherwise entirely beyond their control. The number was not cooperating. December 8th, the mercury dropped to 8 below zero overnight and stayed there until mid-morning. The ground, which had been merely frozen, became something closer to stone. Horses left the barn reluctantly and returned to it with what looked like relief. December 12th brought 31 below a number that silenced the trading post for a full minute when the storekeeper read it aloud. The cold at that temperature was not a weather condition. It was a physical pressure, something you moved through rather than existed in. And the men who had business outdoors that day moved through it quickly and did not linger to discuss the theological implications. December 18th, the mercury in the trading post thermometer touched 38 below and stopped moving. It would stay there frozen at the bottom of its range for the better part of a week, and the actual temperature in those days was a matter of estimation rather than measurement. The wind came out of the north at sustained speeds that made the air feel closer to 60 below than 38, and the snow it carried did not fall so much as to travel horizontally, accumulating, not in drifts but in formations as dense and hard as packed sand. A man walking into that wind leaned at an angle that would have looked to anyone watching from safety like someone defying a physical law. For 23 consecutive days, the temperature in the valley never climbed above zero. The community did not collapse all at once. It degraded. The degradation followed predictable patterns that were nonetheless shocking to witness because they were happening to neighbors rather than to abstractions. The Colby Ranch, the largest and best provisioned operation in the county, burned through 2 cords of seasoned hardwood in the first month and held their main house at 42 degrees, which the ranch foreman reported at the trading post with the stunned flatness of a man reciting something he does not fully believe. His 2 youngest children had developed coughs that had not improved in 3 weeks. The ranch's elderly cook had moved her sleeping pallet directly in front of the kitchen stove and slept sitting up. Smaller operations fared worse. A family on the north end of the valley with a poorly chinked cabin and a woodpile of green timber burned wood that filled their rooms with acrid gray smoke, providing little actual heat because the moisture in the unseasoned wood demanded to be boiled off before the wood itself would surrender its energy. They burned twice as much and got half the warmth and breathed air that left a taste in the throat like wet ash. 2 cabins in the valley's western reach had chimney fires in the same week, both caused by families stoking their fires beyond safe limits in desperation, igniting creosote buildup that had not been cleared since the previous spring. One family saved their home. One family did not. Frank Aldridge, who had ridden out to the Harmon place in October with his concern about reputation, sent word through the county road network in the second week of December that his family was burning half a cord of mixed wood every 7 days and holding his cabin at 46 degrees. His well pump had frozen solid. His wife Margaret was melting snow on the stove for drinking water, a process that required burning additional wood to produce water that was not as clean as well water, and that carried a faint mineral taste that the children complained about until Margaret told them with a firmness that foreclosed further complaint that the water was fine. Livestock began to die. Not in large numbers at first, but the numbers grew. Cattle were found standing frozen in open-sided shelters that had been adequate in previous winters and were not adequate now. Chickens froze on their roosts overnight. A man who had planned to sell 3 hogs in the spring found 2 of them dead on a Monday morning, and the third listless in a way that suggested it was making a decision about which direction to go. People began burning fence posts when their woodpiles ran short. A family on the southern end of the valley was reported to have burned their kitchen table and 2 chairs by the week before Christmas, which crossed some unspoken threshold and became the story people told each other in the lowered voices reserved for genuine catastrophe rather than ordinary hardship. Dignity, as Eli had observed during his service in conditions that taught a man the hierarchy of losses, was always among the first things to go. It was during this time that a 12-year-old boy named Thomas Colby, the ranch foreman's son, carried a message along the county road on horseback and passed the Harmon homestead during a brief lull in the wind. He was moving at a trot, hunched deep into his coat, with his hat pulled low, and he might have passed without looking if something hadn't caught his eye at the edge of the Harmon property. A man was walking from the barn toward the cabin. Not hurrying, not hunched, walking at a normal pace, his arms at his sides, carrying what appeared to be a bucket of milk. He was wearing a flannel shirt with the sleeves rolled to the elbow. Thomas Colby pulled his horse up and stared. The air temperature was somewhere south of 30 below. The wind was building again at his back. The man in the flannel shirt with the rolled sleeves crossed the yard to the corridor entrance and ducked inside without once adjusting his posture to accommodate the cold, without the instinctive bracing and compressing that every other human being in Carbon County performed automatically the moment they stepped into the outside air. Thomas sat on his horse for a full 30 seconds after the man had disappeared inside. Then he rode on and delivered his message and rode back, and when he passed the Harmon place on the return trip, he looked hard at the long, grass-covered mound between the cabin and the barn and tried to understand what he had seen. At supper that evening, he told his father, "Mr. Harmon was outside today in his shirt sleeves." The foreman looked at his son. "You sure it was Harmon?" "Yes, sir, carrying a milk bucket, walking like it was September." The foreman told this story at the Trading Post the following day, presenting it as an account of something strange rather than something significant, the way people in distress sometimes report details that don't fit their current frame of understanding, but that they cannot quite dismiss. The men at the Trading Post received it in the same spirit. Some thought Harmon must be losing his grip on reason, that a man would have to be beyond ordinary judgment to stand outside in that cold without a coat. Some thought the boy had been mistaken about the temperature or the identity of the man. One older rancher said that he had heard of soldiers coming back from overseas with a kind of numbness to cold and heat, both some injury to the nerves that the body sustained in certain conditions, and that perhaps this explained it. Nobody, not one person in that Trading Post conversation, proposed the explanation that actually accounted for what Thomas Colby had seen, that the man had not been cold, because where he was going was warm, genuinely and sustainably warm, and that he had dressed for his destination, rather than for the weather between his door and the corridor entrance, a distance of approximately 12 steps. The smoke from the Harmon chimney was the second thing people began to notice, though most of them noticed it without knowing they were noticing it. The chimneys of Carbon County in December of 1919 produced thick, constant, dark gray smoke, the smoke of fires burning hot and desperate, consuming wood as fast as families could feed it. The Harmon chimney put up a thin wisp of pale gray that drifted and dissipated quickly in the high air. It was the smoke of a fire burning slow and steady, a fire being managed rather than merely sustained, and it rose from the cabin at the same modest volume in the worst cold as it did on mild days. To anyone watching from the road and thinking carefully about what they saw, it was a more unsettling detail than the man in shirt sleeves. A man could be crazy or numb. A fire that burned less in worse cold was something that required a different explanation entirely. Inside the Harmon cabin, life had achieved a quality that none of them had experienced in their first winter there, and that Clara, recording it in her ledger with the same compressed handwriting she had used since January of 1919, found difficult to describe in the numerical terms she had established. The number she could record precisely. The inside temperature most mornings in the first week of December was 64 to 66 degrees. The wood consumption was running at roughly a quarter cord per week, which meant less than a cord per month. The outside temperature she estimated against the Trading Post readings and recorded as a range. But the numbers did not capture the specific texture of what it meant to live inside those numbers. Ada and Meg did their schoolwork at the kitchen table in their cotton dresses, their feet bare against the floorboards, squabbling over a pencil with the mundane ferocity of children who have nothing larger to worry about. Clara cooked in her work dress without an additional layer, something she had not done once during the entire first winter. The water bucket in the corner was water, not ice. The rags along the baseboards were dry. The frost that had colonized the interior walls during their first winter here had not appeared, not on the north wall, not anywhere. The corridor itself had become part of the household's daily geography in a way that Eli had anticipated functionally but not quite emotionally. The girls moved through it freely between house and barn, performing their chores with the cheerful efficiency of children who have been given a task they can accomplish without suffering. The interior of the corridor was chilly, but absolutely profoundly still. A candle brought inside it would burn straight without a flicker. Sound was muffled, the howling that filled every other space in the valley, reduced to a distant theoretical pressure. It was like the inside of a hillside, which is precisely what it was, and the sensation of moving through it had something in common with the sensation of being forgiven by something much larger than yourself. Clara noted in her ledger on December 12th, the morning the temperature dropped to 31 below, that Ada had complained the previous evening that the long division problems in her schoolbook were getting harder. Meg had asked why the children at the Sutton Ranch had to wear their coats to bed. Clara had told her that different families did things differently. Meg had accepted this with the pragmatic flexibility of a 5-year-old and returned to the drawing she was making of a horse that had more legs than regulation horses, but an excellent expression. Clara underlined the temperature entry for that morning twice and wrote beside it in smaller letters than usual, inside 66 degrees Fahrenheit. No change in wood consumption. She had been waiting without consciously framing it as waiting for the cold to overwhelm the system. For some threshold of outside temperature to breach whatever margin the corridor and the earthwork had established, and for the inside temperature to begin its drop toward the conditions of the first winter. The threshold had not appeared. The cold got worse and the inside temperature held, and the holding of it was beginning to feel less like luck and more like physics, which was what Eli had been saying all along, but which Clara needed to see in her own numbers before she was willing to fully believe. It was during the third week of December that she made the decision to visit Margaret. She did not tell Eli she was going. She put on her coat and her boots and walked the 2 miles to the Aldridge place on a morning when the wind had dropped enough to make the walk unpleasant rather than dangerous. And she arrived to find Margaret in the kitchen, wearing a heavy wool coat over 2 sweaters, stirring a pot of oatmeal on a stove that was working as hard as it could and losing the argument with the cold. The baby of the family, 14-month-old Ruth, was asleep near the stove, wrapped in a quilt. She had a high color in her cheeks that was not the color of warmth. The cabin was 40 degrees. Clara felt it the moment she stepped inside the specific quality of cold that has defeated the heat rather than merely contested it. Her own home was 65 degrees that morning. The difference was not a matter of degree, it was a matter of category. Margaret looked at her with the particular expression of a woman who has been managing badly and does not want to be seen managing badly, but has passed beyond the point where concealment is fully possible. Her hands around the pot handle were chapped raw. "Clara, I didn't know you were coming." Clara sat down without being invited to sit. She looked at Ruth and asked how long the baby had been running warm. Margaret said 3 days, nothing serious, she was sure it would pass. Clara asked if Margaret had sent word to Frank's brother in Laramie, who had a wife who had trained as a nurse. Margaret said Frank didn't want to worry anyone over a winter cold. Clara sat with that for a moment. She looked at the pot on the stove, the cold coming in through the north-facing window, the frost on the interior walls that she recognized from her own first winter here. She did not say what she was thinking about the thermal physics of the Aldridge cabin's north wall, or the specific mechanism by which the corridor she had at home was preventing identical conditions. She did not offer to explain how the system worked or suggest that Frank's pride was a less urgent consideration than Ruth's fever. She was not cruel and she was not stupid, and she knew that a woman in Margaret's position did not need instruction at that moment. She needed company, and she needed someone to believe without being told that she was doing the best she could. Clara stayed 2 hours. She held Ruth while Margaret ate a proper meal, sitting down the first one she'd had in several days by the look of one. She helped bank the fire correctly, not higher but steadier, a change in technique rather than fuel consumption that produced a more consistent heat. When she left, she paused at the door and turned back, not with advice, but with something quieter. "Margaret, if Ruth goes higher than she is now, send Tommy over to us, day or night." Margaret's face did something complicated. She understood what was not being said, the implicit offer that existed beneath the explicit one. "Frank wouldn't want—" "I know what Frank would want." Clara's voice was not unkind. It was the voice of a woman who has measured a situation and arrived at the dimensions of what matters. "Send Tommy anyway." She walked back home into the wind and went directly to her ledger and sat at the kitchen table for a moment without opening it. Then she opened it and wrote the date, in the temperatures, in the wood consumption, and below that in the margin beside the numbers a single word that she crossed out and rewrote twice before settling on it. She wrote waiting. She did not go back to see Margaret. She had made the offer, and it was in Margaret's hands now, and Clara understood that certain problems could only be solved by the people who owned them, and that the most useful thing she could do was to be available when the solution became unavoidable. The day that changed things was December 23rd. The temperature that morning was 35 below zero, with a north wind gusting to 40 miles per hour, and the wind chill was a number that the trading post thermometer could not compute, and that the human body registered as something approaching the absolute. Owen Briggs had been making emergency runs all week, loading his work sleigh with seasoned hardwood from the mill's dry storage and delivering it to families he knew were in critical condition. He had not charged for any of it. He had a ledger of his own where he recorded the deliveries not for billing, But because he was a man who recorded things, and the ledger was filling up in a way that troubled him at a level below the economic. He had built these cabins, most of them, or the ones that mattered. He had sized the fireplaces and selected the chinking and advised on window placement and roof pitch, and he had done all of it according to the standards he had been taught and refined over 40 years of building in this climate. And those standards were not holding. The cabins he had built with his own hands were holding 42 degrees and 45 degrees and 40 degrees in conditions that should not, by his understanding of what a well-built structure could accomplish, be defeating them so completely. He drove his sleigh down the county road through the horizontal snow, and he stopped at each name on his list. He stopped at the Colby Ranch and at the Henderson Place, and at two other families on the North Road, and each time he unloaded the wood and assessed the situation and moved on. The last name on his list was Harmon. He had put it last deliberately without quite acknowledging that he had done so. The Harmon delivery was the one he was least sure about. He had told himself he was bringing a quarter cord of his best seasoned oak as a charitable gesture, the same gesture he had made to every other family on the list. He had not told himself what he was actually doing, which was going to confirm what he fully expected to find: a young family with eccentric ideas huddled under their blankets in a failing structure, finally prepared to admit that 40 years of experience in Carbon County building practices was worth more than whatever a combat engineer had learned in his service overseas. The wind tried to take the reins from his hands as he pulled up to the Harmon fence line. He wrapped them twice around the post and pulled his coat tighter and walked up to the cabin door and knocked with the flat of his fist because his knuckles were too numb for it to matter. The door opened. It was Clara who opened it, and the first thing that reached Owen Briggs was not a sight but a physical sensation, a wall of warmth that rolled out of the doorway and pressed against his face with the solid, unhurried confidence of something that had been established rather than improvised. It was not the aggressive, scorching heat of a fire burning past its limits. It was an even settled ambient warmth, the warmth of a room that had been that temperature for long enough to stop trying. He could not speak for a moment. He stood in the doorway with the cold screaming at his back and the warmth pressing against his front, and he was, for the first time in a long professional life, genuinely unable to account for what he was experiencing. Clara looked at him. Behind her at the kitchen table, Ada and Meg sat with papers spread in front of them. They were wearing cotton dresses. Their feet, Briggs registered with a specific jolt of incomprehension, were bare on the wooden floor. They looked up at the draft from the open door with the mild irritation of children interrupted in the middle of something, and then they looked back down at their papers. Clara's voice arrived at him from what felt like a significant distance. "Owen, is everything all right?" Briggs looked at the wood stacked in his sleigh. He looked at the children. He looked at Clara's face, which held no particular triumph, no performance of satisfaction, only the practical attentiveness of a woman assessing whether a visitor needed something from her. "I brought you wood." The words came out flat. "I was worried." Clara stepped back from the door. "That's kind of you. Come in out of the wind." He stepped inside and the door closed behind him, and the sound of the wind disappeared as completely as if someone had taken it away. The room was quiet. The fire in the hearth was burning at a low, steady pace, the orange glow of a fire that is comfortable rather than desperate. He stood in the middle of the kitchen floor and he looked at the wall thermometer, an old mercury unit hanging beside the window, because he needed something measurable to hold on to. The mercury stood clearly at 68 degrees. He walked to it. He put his face close to it. He read it twice. The mercury did not move. Eli came through the interior door from the corridor carrying a bucket. His flannel shirt sleeves rolled to the elbow, and he nodded at Briggs with the unhurried acknowledgement of a man who has been expecting a visitor sooner or later. "Owen," he set the bucket down. "Come a long way in that wind." Briggs turned from the thermometer. His voice had lost whatever professional register it usually operated in. "How are you doing this?" Eli set the bucket on the floor near the dry sink. "Pine and cottonwood. Whatever's on the property. We're at less than 3/4 of a cord every 2 weeks." The silence that followed had a particular texture, the texture of a man performing arithmetic he does not want to finish. Less than 3/4 of a cord every 2 weeks was less than a cord and a half per month. The families on Briggs's delivery list were burning 2 cords every 30 days and holding their homes at temperatures 40 degrees lower than what the thermometer on this wall was showing. The math was not complicated. The math was devastating. Briggs reached out and placed his palm flat against the north wall. The wall that he had examined in September, the wall he had predicted, would be soft with rot and moisture infiltration by February. The wall was cool to the touch and bone dry. Not a trace of frost. Not a whisper of the draft that should by every standard he knew have been moving through the chinking at 35 below outside. He pressed harder as if more pressure might reveal the hidden failure he was certain must be there. There was no hidden failure. There was only a dry, cool, solid wall that had been protected from direct wind exposure since October and was behaving accordingly. Eli set down his bucket and gestured toward the interior door. Briggs followed him to it. Eli opened it onto the corridor, and the two men stood at the threshold. And the air that came through the opening was chilly but motionless, the deep cave-like stillness of a space that the wind had never entered and could not enter. Briggs could hear his own breathing. He could not hear the wind at all. It never touches the house. Eli's voice in the stillness of the corridor was matter-of-fact the voice of a man reporting an observation rather than claiming a victory. The wind hits the outer walls of the corridor and the earthwork, and it moves around and it keeps going north. The cabin is standing in dead air. You can't heat dead air away from you because it's already there. Briggs stepped fully into the corridor. He walked its length, slowly trailing one hand along the lumber framing, looking up at the low roof, looking down at the gravel drainage bed visible in the gap between the stone footings. He was doing what he always did in a structure. He was trying to understand, looking for where it would fail. He looked at the junction of corridor wall and cabin wall, the area he had been most certain about, and he found the flashing exactly where Eli had told him it would be, running 12 inches up behind the tar paper layer, tight and dry, and the earth piled against the exterior, stopping 6 inches below the sill plate where he had said it would stop. There was no moisture. There were no insects. There was no rot. Owen Briggs had built the first structure in his life at the age of 19, and he had been building structures in Carbon County ever since. And he stood in this corridor in the howling worst winter of his professional experience and understood with a clarity that was uncomfortable in proportion to its completeness that he had been solving the wrong problem for 40 years. Every cabin he had ever built in this valley had been designed to generate heat and hold it, the assumption being that if you built tight enough and burned enough, the arithmetic would work in your favor. It never quite did, not completely, because he had been ignoring the variable that negated all the others. He had been building houses and leaving them naked to the wind and then wondering why the wind won. He stood there for a time that was longer than he knew. When he turned back toward the cabin door, his face had the expression of a man who has read a document that revises something he thought was settled. He moved through the interior door and back into the kitchen. Warmth, and he stood near the table where Ada and Meg were drawing, and he looked at the room around him with new eyes, the eyes of someone who has just understood that what he is looking at is not a comfortable room, but a solved problem. Clara was at the stove. She turned and set a cup of coffee on the table near Briggs without asking whether he wanted it. Then she went to the shelf and brought down the ledger, the one she had been keeping since January of 1919, and she set it open in front of him. Briggs looked down at it. 2 years of mornings in Clara's compressed handwriting. Dates, outside temperatures, inside temperatures, wind directions, wood consumed. A running comparison that anyone who could read numbers could understand. The winter of 1918 to 1919, before the corridor showed the numbers he recognized from everywhere in the valley, inside temperatures in the 40s and 50s, wood consumption that would have been impressive in a much larger structure. The winter of 1919 to 1920, after the corridor, showed something that looked, if you read it without knowing what you were looking at, like a transcription error. The inside temperatures held in the mid-60s and touched 68 on recent mornings. The wood consumption was a fraction of the previous years. Before the corridor, after the corridor. The difference between the two columns was not a margin of improvement. It was the difference between two entirely different systems. Briggs turned pages slowly. He was a man who read numbers rather than words, and the numbers spoke to him in the specific language of someone who had spent a lifetime quantifying the performance of buildings. He turned to the most recent entries, and he read them, and he read them again. He looked up at Clara. You kept this from January of last year. January 3rd, before the corridor was built. That's why it starts there. Clara's voice carried nothing more than the fact. I needed to know what we were starting from. Briggs looked down at the ledger for another moment. Then he set it on the table and he looked across the kitchen at Eli, and the look he gave him was not the look of a professional reassessing a competitor. It was something harder and more personal than that, the look of a man who has held a position of authority for long enough that the position has become part of his identity and who is now being required to understand that the authority was always conditional on being correct, and that he was not correct, and that this matters in a way that cannot be resolved quickly or comfortably. My house is 45 degrees. His voice was entirely flat. 2 cords of prime oak a month, 45 degrees. Neither Eli nor Clara said anything. The fire burned its low, steady burn. Ada asked Meg to pass the red pencil. The wind outside pressed against the corridor's outer walls and found nothing to take. Briggs had delivered wood to 7 families that day before he arrived at the Harmon place, and he would deliver to 2 more afterward, and every one of them would be a version of the same story of people burning everything they had against a cold that would not be burned away, holding temperatures that were survivable in the technical sense, while being genuinely miserable in every other sense. He had been telling himself all week that the problem was the severity of the winter, that no builder could have anticipated conditions this extreme, that the standards he had built to were adequate standards for adequate winters. He sat down in the chair Clara had not specifically offered, but had left positioned near the table in the way that people position chairs near tables when they expect someone to need to sit down. He looked at the number on the thermometer one more time across the room. 68 degrees, 35 below, outside. The gap between those 2 numbers, 103 degrees of difference, maintained on less fuel than a fireplace poker could have justified. He had spent 40 years building houses that fought the cold with fire. This man had spent 2 months building something that simply prevented the cold from arriving. The distinction was so obvious once you had seen it that it was difficult to understand how you had missed it, which was, Briggs understood with the grim clarity of genuine learning precisely how the most important distinctions always worked. His voice when it came was a man's voice stripped of the professional register. It had always traveled in quiet and plain-spoken as a confession. We've been doing this wrong for 40 years. The fire didn't respond. The girls didn't look up. Clara turned back to the stove. Eli said nothing because there was nothing to add to that sentence, nothing that would not have diminished it. Briggs left an hour later with his quarter quart of seasoned oak still in the sleigh. Clara had declined it 3 times, and he had not insisted a 4th. He drove back along the county road in the blowing dark, and he did not stop at the trading post. He went home, and he sat at his own kitchen table in his own 45-degree kitchen, and he looked at the walls around him with the new understanding of a man who knows exactly what is wrong and is already calculating, against his own reluctance, what it would take to fix it. He did not tell anyone what he had seen that evening. He was not ready to. The arithmetic of it, the comparison of numbers that could not be argued with, needed time to settle into something he could present as a fact rather than a wound. But the next morning he measured the temperature of his own house carefully and wrote it down, and he wrote down the amount of wood he had burned in the last week, and he put the paper in his coat pocket where it stayed for 5 days while he thought about what to do with it. Word traveled anyway because word always traveled in a valley where the county road was the only artery, and everyone who used it was also an information carrier. It traveled not in the form of gossip this time, not in the form of speculation about a man's courage or sanity, but in the form of a number. Someone had been inside the Harmon place. The thermometer read 68. The cold outside was 35 below. 3/4 of a cord in 2 weeks. These were numbers, and numbers move differently than opinions, and when Briggs eventually confirmed them in the tersely factual way of a man who has stopped arguing with what he has seen, the valley received them with the specific quiet of people who are revising something they thought was finished. Dale Sutton revised nothing, or appeared to revise nothing, until the evening of December 25th, when the temperature dropped again, and one of his prize cows, a brown and white Guernsey, that represented a significant fraction of what spring would bring him, began showing signs that she would not survive the night in his open-sided shelter. Sutton arrived at the Harmon place at 9 in the evening, which in Carbon County in December is a time for emergencies only. He came without announcement and without his earlier volume. He stood at the corridor entrance where Eli had answered the knock, and he looked past Eli at the barn access at the corridor's far end and his face held the particular expression of a man who needs something and is trying to locate a version of asking that does not require him to acknowledge needing it. He said, "I've got a cow that won't last in this cold. If I could put her in your corridor overnight." He stopped, started again. "Just overnight." Eli stepped back from the entrance and held it open without a word. Sutton brought the cow through. She stood in the corridor's chilly stillness, and her labored breathing slowed within 20 minutes, the visible shaking in her haunches, gradually settling as the temperature difference between the corridor and the open shelter registered in her body as safety. Sutton stood with her for an hour, not speaking, while Eli checked on the barn animals, and Clara recorded the night's temperatures in her ledger. The entry for December 26 reads, outside temp approx minus 38 degrees Fahrenheit. Inside cabin, 67 degrees Fahrenheit. Wood no change. Sutton's cow stable. There was no editorializing in the ledger. Clara did not write what she thought about Dale Sutton or about the efficiency of humiliation as a teacher. She wrote what happened, and what happened was that the cow lived, and Sutton collected her the following morning in the gray pre-dawn light, and he nodded once at Eli and walked her back down the road without a word, and the nod was everything and nothing, and both at once. Frank Aldridge's knock came on December 28th, 11 o'clock at night. Clara heard it first. She was still at the kitchen table with her ledger recording the day's numbers by lantern light while Eli slept. She opened the door to find her brother standing in the wind with his coat frozen stiff around him, the ice in his beard catching the lantern light, and his eyes holding the specific and undeniable communication of a man who has run out of positions to defend. Ruth's fever is 104. His voice was stripped of everything that was not the essential fact. Margaret's melting snow. 2 days of wood left, maybe 3. A pause, and then with the difficulty of a large stone being moved by hand, Eli said there was a simpler version. A wall, 40 feet north, 10 feet high. Clara held the door wider. "Come inside." She was already reaching for her coat with her other hand. "I'm going to Margaret now. You wake Eli." Frank stepped into the warmth of the kitchen and stopped moving for just a moment, the way a body stops when the cold it has been holding against finally releases. He looked at the thermometer. He looked at the table where his niece's drawings were still spread across the surface from that afternoon. He looked at the steady, calm fire in the hearth. When Eli appeared in the doorway from the bedroom, his hair pressed on one side from the pillow, Frank Aldridge looked at his brother-in-law with the look of a man who has arrived at the end of a long argument with himself and lost it fairly. There was no apology in his face. He was not a man whose face did apologies easily, but there was something honest there, the honesty of someone who has decided that the cost of his position has finally exceeded the cost of changing it. "Show me how it works," Frank said. "All of it. Show me how to build it." Clara walked the 2 miles to the Aldridge place through the dark and the cold with a lantern and her medical kit, which was not a doctor's bag, but a canvas pouch containing the practical knowledge of a woman who had been the nearest thing to medical authority within 5 miles of her home for 2 winters running. The wind had not dropped. It hit her from the north with the patient malice of something that has outlasted every argument against it, and she leaned into it and kept moving in the lantern, making a small golden argument for the existence of warmth in a landscape that was otherwise a thorough case against it. Margaret opened the door before Clara knocked, having heard the lantern light through the window. Ruth was in the back room, wrapped in every quilt. The house contained her breathing audible from the doorway, the wet and labored breathing of a fever that has been climbing for too long without supervision. Clara went to her directly and put the back of her hand against the child's forehead, and then her cheek, and then the soft skin below the jaw where the glands lived, and she felt what she had come to feel for, and found more of it than she had hoped. She worked for 2 hours with the methodical competence of someone who has decided that efficiency is the most useful form of care available to her. She brought the fever down with cold compresses applied in sequence, not ice, which was everywhere and wrong for this, but cloth wetted in the coldest water from the stove's reservoir and applied to the pulse points at wrist and neck in the crease of the elbow. She made Margaret drink hot water with a small quantity of salt dissolved in it, because Margaret had been running herself down for weeks and her hands told the story of a body consuming its own reserves. She banked the fire in the bedroom to the correct level, Not the panicked roar it had been burning at, but a steady, measured output that would hold through the night without requiring someone to sit beside it awake. By 1 in the morning, Ruth's breathing had changed, not resolved, but changed the wet labor of it, giving way to something shallower and more regular. Clara sat beside the bed for another hour, making sure the change held. Margaret had fallen asleep in the chair beside the door, her head tipped back at the angle of someone who has finally surrendered to exhaustion, and Clara let her sleep. The cabin was 41 degrees. Clara had not checked when she arrived because checking would have required her to stop moving, and stopping was not the priority. She checked now with the small thermometer she carried in her kit, and the number it returned was worse than she had guessed and better than she had feared. The window on the north wall showed a fine tracery of ice crystals on the interior glass, delicate and complete as lacework, and the baseboards beneath it were cold enough to feel through the sole of a boot. The wind pressed against that wall with a steady, rhythmic insistence that was almost conversational, as if it were saying the same thing repeatedly, in the hope that repetition would eventually produce a different response. Clara sat with Ruth until 4 in the morning, when the child's color had settled from the bright, dangerous red of high fever to a milder rose that meant the worst of it had passed for now. She roused Margaret enough to tell her what to watch for and what to do if the fever climbed again, and she left the directions in writing on the table because Margaret was too tired for anything spoken to stick with any reliability. Then she walked back through the dark and the cold and let herself into the cabin and sat at the table with her coat still on, and she opened her ledger to the current page and wrote down what the Aldrich cabin's thermometer had said and what Ruth's condition was and what time she had left. When Eli came through the corridor door at 5:30 with the milk, he found her asleep at the table with her head on her arms and the ledger open beneath her cheek. He let her sleep. He was at the Aldrich place by 7, arriving with a Frank's first light on a morning that had gone still for the first time in days, the cold absolute and windless, and somehow worse for the absence of the sound it usually traveled with. Eli walked the exterior of the Aldrich cabin twice before he spoke, the way he always moved around a structure. He was reading, his eyes tracking from foundation to roof line and back, measuring distances with the carpenter's string he kept in his coat pocket, noting the relationship between the cabin's north wall and the prevailing wind's direction and the distance to the nearest outbuilding. Frank watched him from the porch, his breath making brief white architecture in the still air. The outbuilding was a storage shed 20 feet north of the cabin and 8 feet tall, and it was not the right dimensions or the right position to do what needed doing. But the principle did not require the specific structure. It required the principle, which was this: remove the north wall of the cabin from the wind's direct contact and replace the moving air that had been pressing against it with a body of still air that the wind could not penetrate. The method by which you accomplished this was secondary to the understanding of why it worked, because a man who understood why it worked could adapt the method to whatever materials and geometry his situation provided. Eli found a flat piece of board near the shed and crouched on the frozen ground and drew on it with a nail, the same instrument he had used on a piece of scrap pine in his own kitchen in the winter of 1918. A rectangle for the cabin, a line 40 feet north of the cabin's north wall, a second rectangle along that line 10 feet high, built from whatever lumber Frank had or could get from Briggs in the spring, running the full width of the cabin's north face, plus 3 feet on each side. The wall would stand alone with no roof, no corridor, no earthwork, because Frank did not have the time or the materials for the full structure, and because the abbreviated version would accomplish 60% of the thermal benefit at 20% of the effort. Frank studied the drawing for a long time. He was a man who processed visual information carefully, who did not like to ask questions that admitted incomplete understanding, but who was also, at this particular moment in his life, no longer in a position to let that preference cost him anything. The wall alone, he said finally, no corridor, no tunnel. The corridor is the complete version. Eli set the nail down and stood. The wall is the principle. It breaks the wind, creates dead air between itself and the north face of your cabin. The dead air doesn't move, so it doesn't pull heat from your walls. Last winter, Thomas's family cut their wood consumption by 40% with just the wall version. Not identical to what we have, but the same logic. Frank looked at the distance between his cabin and where the wall would stand. He looked at the shed, which was in roughly the right vicinity, and could potentially be rebuilt or extended into something that served the purpose. He looked at the north horizon, which was offering nothing threatening at the moment, but was making no promises. He didn't apologize. He never would. But when he looked back at Eli, his face held the particular quality of a man who has stopped spending energy on a position he can no longer afford to hold, and the energy that had been going to that position was now available for something useful. "I'll start when the freeze breaks," Frank said. "You'll help me get the dimensions right." Eli picked up the piece of board with the drawing on it and handed it to him. "The dimensions are right there." He walked home in the still, cold morning and found Clara awake at the table with fresh coffee and her ledger open to a page she had been reviewing, not writing, just reading back over numbers she already knew. She looked up when he came in, and he told her Ruth was going to be fine and that Frank was building the wall in the spring. Clara looked at him for a moment and then looked back down at her ledger and turned to the current page and picked up her pencil and wrote the date at the top of a fresh entry. The still air lasted 2 days, and then the wind came back and the valley settled back into the mechanical endurance that December of 1919 required of everyone in it. The letter arrived at the Carbon County Extension Office in the second week of January, addressed to the regional agricultural agent in terms that mixed professional inquiry with personal bewilderment. The letter had been written by Owen Briggs, who was not a man given to letter writing, but who had concluded after 3 weeks of private calculation that what he had seen at the Harmon place was too significant to remain inside his own head, and that the appropriate receptacle for it was the state's institutional apparatus for exactly this kind of thing. His letter described what he had seen with the precision of a builder's report: the outside temperature at time of visit, the inside temperature as read from a calibrated wall thermometer, the fuel consumption as reported by the home owner and corroborated by the remaining woodpile, and the structural principle he believed accounted for the discrepancy. He included the comparison figures for his own home and for 2 other structures he knew well. He did not editorialize. He let the numbers speak, which they did with the kind of authority that numbers carry when they are positioned correctly. Roy Clanton arrived at the Harmon place on a Tuesday morning in the 3rd week of January, carrying 2 thermometers he had calibrated against the state standard instrument in Cheyenne, an anemometer for wind measurement, in the particular expression of an institutional skeptic who has been handed something that he suspects is not as remarkable as the person who handed it to him believes, but who is professional enough to come and look before deciding. He was a methodical man in his early 40s who had spent 15 years producing agricultural bulletins that nobody read until something went wrong, and he had the patience for the undramatic work of measurement and documentation that most people abandoned when it failed to produce immediate results. He carried a notebook that was already half full with observations from 3 other properties he had visited that week, all of them reporting conditions that the standard building guidance of the State Extension Office should have prevented. Clara opened the door to him, and he stepped inside, and his prepared professional neutrality encountered the same obstacle it had encountered for Owen Briggs: the warmth. He stood just inside the threshold, and he felt it not as a comfortable temperature, but as a fact about the structure, as information rather than sensation, and he reached into his coat and took out one of his calibrated thermometers and held it up in the middle of the kitchen and waited. 67 degrees. He wrote the number in his notebook. He looked at the window. He looked at the fire. He asked Clara for the outside temperature reading from her porch thermometer, and she gave it to him, and he went outside and confirmed it with his own instrument, 22 below. He noted the wind speed in the open yard, 38 miles per hour, gusting periodically to 41. He noted the direction north-northwest, which put the corridor directly in its path. Then he asked Eli to show him the corridor, and he took his anemometer inside and walked to the north end, to the narrow space between the cabin's north wall and the corridor's south-facing interior partition, and he held the anemometer's cups in that space and watched them turn. They barely moved. He read the instrument 3 miles per hour. He walked the full 40-foot length of the corridor and took readings at 6 points along its span, and the highest reading he got was 3.5 miles per hour in the easternmost quarter, where a small gap in the earthwork allowed a thread of indirect airflow. He wrote each number in his notebook in sequence, and then he went back outside and held the anemometer in the open again and watched the cup spin at 41 miles per hour, and he wrote that number below the corridor readings and drew a line beneath it and wrote 92%. He stood in the open yard doing arithmetic that was not complicated, but that he did twice to be sure, because its implications for everything the Extension Office had been advising for 2 decades were significant enough to warrant being sure. He went back inside. Clara was at the table with her ledger, which she had opened without being asked, because she had understood from the moment Roy Clanton stepped out of his wagon that he was not the kind of visitor who needed things explained to him, but was the kind who needed to see what was already there. Clanton sat down across from her, and she turned the ledger to face him, and he put on the reading glasses he kept in his breast pocket, and he began at the beginning. He read slowly. He turned pages. He read the first winter's entries, the baseline data from before the corridor existed, the inside temperatures that tracked with everything he had been seeing at other properties all week, the fuel consumption that represented a significant fraction of what a family of 4 could reasonably acquire and afford. Then he turned to the page where the corridor's completion was noted in the margin in Clara's handwriting, a single line, corridor finished. October 14th. The numbers changed on the next page. Not dramatically, because October was not the testing season, and the temperatures outside were not yet the temperatures that separated adequate building practice from inadequate. But the directionality was immediate and visible. Even in the mild early winter readings, the inside temperature holding higher on the same fuel the drafts that Clara had noted on specific mornings in the previous year, no longer appearing in the record. Then December came in the ledger, and the numbers became what they were. Clanton read to the current date without looking up. When he finished, he sat back and removed his glasses and cleaned them with the cloth he kept in the same pocket, a gesture he performed when he was thinking, using the act of cleaning as a substitute for speaking until the thinking was done. He looked at Clara. "You began keeping this record in January of last year." January 3rd, 1919, before the corridor was planned or built. "You were recording conditions before and after." He tapped the ledger with one finger. "This isn't just documentation of the new structure. It's a controlled comparison." Clara's voice carried the even quality of someone who has always known what something was and is simply confirming it for someone else's benefit. "That's why I started when I did." Clanton looked across the table at Eli, who was standing near the window. He looked back at Clara. He looked down at the ledger again, at the 2 years of mornings in her compressed handwriting, the outside temperatures and inside temperatures, and fuel consumption and wind directions recorded with the consistency of someone who understands that data is only as good as its completeness. A careful investigator understood the difference between evidence and proof in what was sitting on this kitchen table in Carbon County, Wyoming. In January of 1920 was not evidence. It was proof. 2 winters fully documented with a clear intervention point separating the before from the after. The numbers did not suggest that the corridor worked. They demonstrated it with the finality of a sentence that does not require a period, because the full stop is built into the meaning. Clanton closed his notebook and opened it again to a fresh page. "Mrs. Harmon, I'd like to take a copy of these records back with me. The original stays here, obviously." Clara held the ledger for a moment. She looked at it the way a person looks at something they made, not with vanity, but with the quiet recognition of a thing that represents a particular investment of attention over a period of time. "You can have a copy. I'll write it out for you before you leave." She spent 2 hours at the table that afternoon making a clean copy of the ledger's entries in her clearest handwriting, while Clanton measured every dimension of the corridor and the earthwork and made his own drawings in his notebook. Eli answered his technical questions with the brevity of someone who has explained a thing many times but who understands that this particular explanation has a different destination than the previous ones. Clanton asked about the frost line depth and the gravel bed specification and the flashing installation and the vent sizing, and Eli answered each question with numbers, because Clanton was a man who received numbers better than descriptions. Before he left, Clanton stood in the kitchen doorway and looked at the thermometer one final time. 67 degrees. His calibrated instrument confirmed it. He wrote the number in his notebook below all the other numbers, and he put his notebook in his coat pocket, and he said, "I'm going to write a bulletin." Eli said, "Write what's useful." Clanton nodded and went out to his wagon and drove south along the county road, and the pale afternoon light came through the kitchen window and landed on the table where Clara's copy of the ledger lay, drying 2 years of mornings rendered in duplicate, ready to travel. The thaw came in the middle of January, not a full thaw, but a break in the sustained below-zero cold, the temperature climbing briefly to the teens and then to the low 20s, which in the context of the previous 4 weeks felt almost temperate. People came out of their houses and assessed their wood piles and their livestock losses and each other's faces, and the assessments were uniformly sobering. Word about the Harmon place had been moving through the valley since Briggs's delivery run, shifting in nature as it moved from the currency of gossip to the harder currency of confirmed numbers. Briggs had not been silent after his initial reserve wore down. He had told 3 people the specific figures of the thermometer, reading the fuel comparison, and those 3 people had each told 3 more, and the transmission of numbers is different from the transmission of stories, because numbers cannot be embellished without becoming false. And people who pass false numbers along to neighbors, they will see tomorrow, are taking a social risk they rarely choose to take. By the time the cold broke, the valley had a rough consensus that something real had happened at the Harmon place, that it could be quantified, and that it challenged something fundamental about the way every cabin in the county had been conceived and built. The community meeting in February was held at the church, which was the largest heated space in the valley, and which had the additional advantage of being a place where people were accustomed to sitting still and listening to things that required them to change how they thought. The meeting had been called by the county commissioner for the stated purpose of assessing winter losses and planning for spring, which was genuine enough, but everyone who came knew that there was a secondary agenda being carried into the room by the weight of the winter just survived and the questions it had produced. Eli and Clara sat near the back. Ada and Meg were with Margaret Aldrich, who had recovered her composure along with Ruth's health, her gratitude toward Clara taking the practical form of offering to watch the girls rather than the more complicated form of saying anything about the previous month's dynamics. Clara had accepted this without comment. Dale Sutton sat on the far side of the room and did not look in Eli's direction, which was a form of acknowledgement in itself. The meeting moved through its official business with the efficiency of people who have other things on their minds. The inventory of losses documented the mutual aid arrangements formalized for families whose spring would be materially harder than expected. Then the commissioner looked up from his papers and looked at Owen Briggs, who was sitting in the 3rd row with his large hands on his knees, and there was a moment of unspoken communication between them. Briggs stood up. He did not look at Eli when he began. He looked at the room, at the faces of people he had been building for since before some of them were born, and he spoke in the deliberate, specific way he applied to any subject where precision mattered. He described what he had seen on December 23rd. He gave the numbers without commentary, the inside temperature against the outside temperature, the fuel consumption against every comparable structure he knew. He described the corridor, its dimensions and its materials, and the principle he understood to be operating the wind barrier, creating a body of still air that insulated the cabin's north wall more effectively than any material he knew how to install. The room was quiet in the way of people who are revising rather than simply listening. Then Briggs said with the gravity of a man delivering a professional verdict on himself, "I have been building in this county for 40 years. I have advised people on construction and insulation and heating, and I have believed I was giving them correct advice. I was giving them the best advice I had, which was not the same thing." He paused. "I did not understand wind as a thermal factor. I did not build structures that accounted for it. Eli Harmon built a structure that did, and his family spent this winter in comfort that none of my buildings provided." He stopped again. "I am not going to pretend that is a small thing." The room stayed quiet for several seconds after he sat down. Not the quiet of an audience processing a performance, but the quiet of a room in which something has settled, some long suspended weight, finally coming to rest on the floor where it can be dealt with rather than accommodated in the air, where it has been hanging. Eli stood up. He had not planned to speak or had not allowed himself to plan it, because planning a speech requires believing in advance that you will be given a platform, and he was a man who had spent 18 months building a platform that the community had been determined to deny him. He stood in the back of the church in Carbon County in the winter of 1920, and he looked at the faces turned toward him, faces he knew by sight and sometimes by name, faces that had carried opinions about him that he had felt without needing to be told, and he spoke quietly enough that the room had to settle further to hear him. "Nobody taught me this. Nobody taught any of you either. I spent a winter being cold, and I paid attention to where the cold was coming from, And then I spent the following summer building something based on what I observed. A pause in which the room held itself very still. I'm not trying to impress anyone. I tried to keep my family warm. That's the only thing I was doing. He sat back down. The room let out a breath that had been held for a long time. What followed was not a dramatic conversion. Conversion in Carbon County happened slowly and practically and without flourish, the way the ground thawed from the surface downward in small daily increments that were individually invisible and cumulatively decisive. By March 7, families had come to the Harmon place to see the corridor in person, and Eli had sat with each of them at the kitchen table and drawn diagrams on whatever flat surface was available, and explained the principle with the patient repetition of a man who understands that an idea has to be understood rather than accepted. He distinguished clearly between the full corridor, which was the optimal version requiring specific conditions and materials, and the simpler wind wall, which could be built from available lumber in a single weekend and which would capture most of the thermal benefit with a fraction of the complexity. He did not say which version was better. He described both accurately and let each family determine what their situation required. Frank Aldridge built his wind wall in April when the ground had softened enough to set the posts. He built it 40 feet north of his cabin's north face, 10 feet high, running 44 feet across to provide 3 feet of overlap on each side. He used dimensional lumber from Briggs's mill and set the posts 4 feet deep with concrete footings, a modification Eli had suggested for structural stability in the high plains wind. And when he was done, the wall stood in the spring green grass looking purposeful and plain, a vertical line drawn between the cabin and the sky to the north. The following winter, Frank burned 40% less wood than the year before. His cabin held 58 degrees against a January that was not as severe as 1919, but was cold enough to be honest. He wrote this down in a ledger he had started keeping in March, a ledger that was shorter and less precise than Clara's, but that captured the essential comparison. He did not give the ledger to anyone. He kept it on his shelf next to his ranch accounts, and he looked at it sometimes in the evenings with the private satisfaction of a man who has learned something at a price he is still paying but no longer resents paying. By summer of 1920, 19 homesteads in Carbon County had built some version of a northern wind barrier. Some were simple board fences 6 feet high that provided partial benefit. Some were the full wall specification. 2 families attempted earthen berms similar in principle to the corridor's exterior walls, using excavated soil to create a ground-level wind shadow against their north-facing walls. Owen Briggs built a variation on 2 of his client projects that fall an L-shaped storage annex that closed off the north and northwest exposure of the cabin simultaneously, and that Briggs had engineered with a level of thermal precision he had not applied to his work before. He charged his clients for the annex as functional storage space and absorbed the additional design complexity as professional education. The wood consumption data that the county commissioner had begun collecting in the spring of 1920, partly at Clanton's suggestion, showed the first measurable decrease in total valley-wide fuel use in the recorded history of the county. The decrease was not large. It was 7%, a number that in isolation might suggest normal variation. In the context of a winter that had been colder than average and a fuel supply that had been strained, it was a number that suggested something systematic had changed. Clanton's bulletin appeared in September of 1920, published through the Wyoming State Agricultural Extension, under the dry, technical title that such documents required. It was 12 pages long with diagrams, the diagrams drawn from Eli's specifications and Clanton's own measurements, and it laid out the principle of convective heat loss, the mechanics of wind barrier construction at several scales, and the performance data from the Harmon corridor in tables that invited comparison with the baseline figures recorded in the pre-corridor ledger. The title page of the bulletin below the institutional header and above the technical abstract carried a data attribution line. Clanton had written it in the plain language of academic citation, acknowledging the source of the primary performance data that underpinned the entire document. Clara Harmon, Carbon County, Wyoming. Daily temperature and fuel consumption records, January 1919 through February 1920. Clara read it twice when Clanton sent her the advanced copy sitting at the kitchen table in September, with the girls playing outside and Eli in the north field and the afternoon light coming through the kitchen window at the low angle of a season turning. She held the bulletin for a long time after reading it, not with the theatrical emotion of someone receiving unexpected recognition, but with the more complicated feeling of someone who has done a thing in private without external validation over a long period of time, and who is now holding evidence that the thing was real. She had not kept the ledger to be acknowledged. She had kept it because she believed the ledger was necessary to distinguish between what worked and what merely appeared to work. And because she understood that the difference between those two things mattered more than whether anyone else ever knew she had drawn it. The fact that the record now existed in a state bulletin that would travel to extension offices across Wyoming and Montana and the Dakotas, that it would be the data foundation for advice given to families and counties whose names she had never heard, that was information she processed with a quality of stillness that Eli, watching her from the doorway where he had returned early from the field, recognized as something important. He sat down across from her, and she handed him the bulletin, and he read the attribution line. He set the bulletin on the table, and he looked at her, and she looked at him, and in the specific language of two people who have built something together in a context that did not offer them much room for sentiment, what passed between them in that look was everything that needed to be said and considerably more efficient than saying it. Outside, Meg was asking Ada a question about something. Ada's answer was long and authoritative. Meg's response indicated that the answer had not settled the matter. The bulletin moved through the institutional channels of state agriculture, the way such documents move slowly, unevenly, reaching some offices and bypassing others, read carefully by some agents and filed unread by others, but accumulating over the years a secondary life in citations and adaptations and the specific variation that happens when a practical idea reaches a practitioner who improves it for local conditions. By the end of the decade, variations on the earth-bermed wind barrier were being incorporated into new construction guidelines in 3 northern plains, states in language that had been translated and retranslated through so many intermediate documents that the original source was no longer traceable. The Harmon homestead remained. 20 years after the corridor was built, it still connected the cabin and the barn in its long grass-covered mound, the earthwork now fully consolidated by seasons of freeze and thaw into something that looked genuinely geological, as though the hill had been there before the buildings. The corridor had outlasted 2 of the more conventionally constructed outbuildings on the property, which had required replacement, and it had required only 2 interventions. In 20 years, a section of roof flashing, replaced in the 4th year, when a hard freeze followed by rapid thaw had worked one seam loose, and a portion of the eastern earthwork repacked in the 7th year, when a wet spring had caused some settling. Both repairs had taken a single afternoon. In the spring of 1939, a young man from the University of Wyoming's engineering program arrived at the Harmon place on a Tuesday afternoon with a notebook and the formal introduction of a graduate student conducting field research on indigenous construction techniques of the High Plains. He was 23 years old, and he used the word indigenous in its technical sense, meaning construction knowledge developed organically from local conditions rather than imported from formal engineering, education, and he was earnest in the way of young researchers who have not yet had their earnestness tested by contact with the actual world. Eli Harmon was 48 years old, grayer than the early photographs in the County Historical Archive suggested, and somewhat thinner with the particular quality of stillness that settles into men who have lived long enough in open country for the country to become part of their physical bearing. He took the young man around the property with the unhurried patience of someone for whom the familiar is still visible rather than invisible, pointing out the earthwork and the drainage bed and the flashing and the vents with their seasonal shutters, explaining the sequence of the construction in the same spare language he had always used for it. The young man asked good questions. He had read Clanton's bulletin, which had become a minor citation in the academic literature on passive thermal design, and he had the conceptual framework, but not the physical intuition that came from having built something and watched it work across 2 decades of seasons. He asked about the earthwork composition and the frost line depth and the specific angle of the roof pitch, and Eli answered each question accurately and completely. At the end of the tour, the young man asked whether Eli was proud of what he had created, and he used the word created with the enthusiasm of someone who believes he is being generous, who believes he is conferring something with the word. Eli shook his head once. He looked out at the windswept grass of the high plains at the northern horizon, that had been the source of everything and against which the corridor was a permanent, quiet argument. This isn't created. The earth knows how to hold warmth. The wind knows how to take it. All I did was pay attention to what was already true and build something that didn't pretend otherwise. The young man wrote this down as people tended to write down the things Eli said, not because he said them impressively, but because they had the quality of statements that contain more than they appear to, and that yield additional meaning at intervals long after they have been heard. Clara came out of the cabin with coffee, and the young man stood to accept his cup and looked at the corridor with the fresh eyes of someone who had not seen it before and was still understanding what he was looking at. The grass on the earthwork was thick and deep-rooted now, the kind of grass that takes years to establish, and that once established, holds the soil against whatever the weather applies to it. The two dark openings at either end had developed a patina of use and permanence that made them look less like architectural elements and more like features of the landscape, like the openings of natural formations that predate the buildings they serve. Clara set her own cup on the porch rail and looked at the structure with the direct, appraising look of someone checking whether a thing is still performing the function for which it was built. It was. It had been for 20 years. The north wall of the cabin was dry and solid and free of the moisture and rot that Owen Briggs had predicted with professional certainty in the autumn of 1919. The cabin was warmer than any building of its size, and construction in the county, measured against the Extension Office's own data from the annual fuel consumption surveys that had been running since 1920. The young man asked Clara if she had thoughts about the design, and she considered the question with the same care she applied to everything she was asked directly. "The corridor is a soldier's word," she said finally, looking at the long mound between the buildings. "Eli grew up using it for passages that move men from one position to another without exposing them to fire. That's what this does. It moves us from one place to another without exposing the house to the wind." She picked up her coffee. People spent a long time calling it a coward's design because they thought avoiding a fight was the same as being afraid of one. Eli was never afraid of the Wyoming winter. She looked at the young man steadily. He just refused to fight it on its terms. The young man wrote that down too, and the handwriting in his notebook where he recorded it was slightly different from the handwriting around it, the kind of variation that occurs when someone is writing faster than their normal pace because they are afraid of losing the exact words. He stayed through the afternoon and into the evening, and at some point Ada, who was now 28 years old and had come out from town with her husband to help with the spring work, brought out a plate of food and set it on the porch table, and the conversation became less formal and more general, ranging from the young man's research to the state of the university's engineering program to the spring planting and what the weather had been doing in recent weeks. Meg, who was 26 and had the same compressed handwriting as her mother and the same quality of attention to things that other people found unremarkable, sat on the porch steps and listened to the conversation with the sideways attentiveness of someone who is thinking about something adjacent to what is being said. Before the young man left, she asked him a question that stopped him at his wagon, whether the university's engineering curriculum included any component on observation as a design methodology on the practice of watching a specific environment over a sufficient period of time before attempting to modify it. The young man said that the curriculum was primarily theoretical in its first 2 years and moved to applied methodology in the third and fourth. Meg looked at him for a moment. "My mother kept a temperature log for 14 months before anyone would have called what she was doing research. She kept it because she believed you needed to know exactly what was happening before you could know whether you were changing it." She looked at the cabin behind her. "The corridor worked because my father understood the physics. It was documented because my mother understood the difference between knowing something and being able to prove it." She turned back to the young man. "Your curriculum might consider teaching both." He drove away in the long golden light of a Wyoming spring evening, and the Harmon family sat on the porch in the mild air while the sun went down behind the western ridge and the north wind came up as it always came up in the evening, moving across the open miles with its patient, reliable purpose. It hit the corridor's earthwork and divided and moved around and kept going south the way water moves around a stone that has been in the stream long enough to have made itself part of the stream's vocabulary. The cabin's north wall stood dry and still in the dead air behind the barrier, holding its temperature through the cooling evening, the same way it had held it through 20 winters, through the social architecture of ridicule and the physical architecture of the worst cold in a generation, through the long accumulation of mornings that Clara had recorded and the long accumulation of seasons that the structure itself had recorded in its continued standing. In the kitchen, the thermometer hung beside the window where it had always hung, and the number it held in the evening light was the number it held through every season, now within a comfortable range maintained on a modest and reasonable quantity of wood in a cabin on the high plains of Wyoming that the wind had been trying to own for 2 decades and had never succeeded in owning because the man and the woman who built it had understood something simple and difficult and had had the patience to demonstrate it against the full weight of what everyone else knew for certain. The fire burned low and steady and said nothing that needed to be said.